FCS Fans Nation, welcome back to another chaotic week of the spring FCS season. You are listening to the FCS Fans Nation podcast, joined tonight by the unbiased Bison admin Matthew Frazee, Kyler Neal, the main man for Eagles Power Hour, and you know what? He did so well last week. We kicked Chris and Duke Dula, can't remember his name, right off the podcast. We're bringing Jamie Williams back into the fold with us guys tonight. So Jamie, Kyler, and Matt are going to be holding down the fort for you. Gentlemen, I just cracked open a Mountain Dew because I've had a crazy work week. Don't even know if I could handle a Busch Light, as crazy as that sounds. Kyler, you look like you're sipping on something nice. How are you doing, my man?
I'm doing good. The real reason why we kicked off Chris, let's just be honest, is because we were called out for all being biased, and Chris was somehow the only unbiased guy. So we said, screw that guy. We're doing it without him. We want a biased podcast, and we're going to do it.
Speaking of biased podcasts, that is happening this year. I came up with that idea last week. So here's the little promo before we kick into things. I am going to find 4 to 5 of the most biased people on our page, and they are just going to give legitimate emotion, like exactly how they feel. I'm going to call it the Bison podcast, or the bias. Oh, wow. I mixed bias and Bison. We're going to
already there.
Yeah, there you go. We're going to call it the Bison podcast. So that's the promo, folks. In 2-3 weeks, prepare for absolute chaos. But Jamie, good to have you back, man. We're going to roll right into some questions tonight. And we're going to start off with Mr. Shane Klebert. As everybody knows, the FCS Fans Nation podcast is driven by questions given to us on our page by our fans. So we do not make these topics up. We're going to answer anything that they put out there for us. And we're going to start off with Mr. Shane Klebert, an awesome Nicholls fan. And I'm going to read what he has to say here. And then we're going to roll into a big discussion about Nicholls and what is our game of the week next week with Sam Houston. He wants to know a little bit about that game last week first, though. He says, did Nicholls' mistakes at Northwestern State help or hurt them in their preparation for Sam Houston? If you guys weren't aware from Shane's info, Nicholls committed 2 turnovers versus NWST. They dropped 2 interceptions inside the red zone. They had a litany of mistakes where that game could have been more of a blowout. The game would have been 28-7 at half, and the time of possession was 40 minutes to 20 minutes in Nicholls' favor. So there's a lot of details to why Shane believes his Nicholls team could have done better. But here are his big questions. How important is the Nicholls at Sam Houston to national contender conversation? And is that matchup the game of the week next week? So how did we feel, guys, about that matchup for Nicholls from last week for preparation? And how should they look next week going up against Sam Houston? Jamie, did you have some initial thoughts just looking at Nicholls, who basically obliterated their first 2 opponents before having a close one last week?
Yeah, I was really interested in seeing what they would do against the Southland team, even though it was Northwestern State. I've had some mistakes, but at the end of the day, they came through. They did what they had been doing. They won. They moved through another opponent, a lesser opponent, struggled for a little while, but at the end of the day, good win for them. And just last week was my first pod, so I was just trying to play it close. Now I'm going to say, people, stop whining if we don't talk about conferences that aren't the big 3. Be like Shane, ask a question. It'll get answered.
Jamie's got it down. He's got it down.
Okay.
If the question's out there, we do it.
So so back to Nicholls, this is a huge game this week. It will probably decide the Southland. And honestly, the winner of this game could wind up with a seed. We'll see.
It's going to be absolutely huge. And Nicholls actually they've given up 27 points on the year defensively. 24 of those came last week against Northwestern State. So prior to that, you could definitely talk about level of competition, but they just blew opponents outside of the water besides that thing. That Nicholls and Sam Houston game is huge. I'm actually one of the rare people who stands on a hill right now and actually has Sam Houston ranked where basically Nicholls is. Like right now in the national polls, you have Nicholls at number 7. You have Sam Houston at number 12. I'm kind of the opposite. I have them up at 5 and 10 with Sam Houston being higher. So I actually have more belief that Sam Houston wins that game. They only have the one matchup right now with C-Law, but that was a ranked win for them. It was basically a shootout. So I think that kind of helps Sam Houston when they're going to be playing Nicholls, because we keep hearing about Nicholls' explosive offense, even though defensively their numbers look really good. So Sam Houston, you would think, okay, last season, it seemed like their offense maybe was the struggle. They had a quarterback injury, but the defense had really good statistics. Well, in the first game, they had to win a shootout, and they made it happen. This game is also in Sam Houston. So to answer your question, Shane, it definitely is the game of the week. And this will 100% put everybody on alert in terms of, is the actual Southland team, whether it's Sam Houston, Nicholls, or maybe somebody else by the end of it, a national title contender. So it's going to put you on the map. Kyler, do you have any kind of pushback on any of those takes? What do you think, man?
Well, Nicholls is a weird team because, every single week the competition level has gone up. Now, when you're saying has gone up, we're also still talking about Northwestern State. That's not a top tier competition. So, I mean, that speaks volumes for the first 3 weeks. But some of the positives with Nicholls was, their defense shut down the passing opportunity. I mean, Northwestern State could not throw the ball if their life depended on it. If I am hanging off a cliff and I need Northwestern to save me, and it was saving me by throwing 10 yards, I'm not getting saved with that Nicholls defense playing Northwestern State. But what was alarming was Northwestern State was able to run all over Nicholls, and that might have exposed something for the future of Nicholls moving forward, because anytime a team is average rush is 10 yards a first down, you have some flaws that you need to pick up. Now, I don't know if there was injuries on the defensive line. I'm not fully aware of what maybe happened. But to answer your question, this was the game of the week I picked on our pick'em. Sam Houston State versus Nicholls. This is a top 10 caliber game. Winner probably takes the Southland, especially with Central Arkansas out of the conversation. Both of these teams are playoff caliber teams. Both of these teams, even if one of them loses this weekend, which of course one of them will, it is a game. It's not going to end in a tie. But realistically, both of them could be playoff teams. One of them will get the at-large if the only losses to the other team. This is by far the game of the week, but I'm more nervous on the Nicholls side just because of what happened this last week. Sam Houston, like you said, Matt Frazee, last year, amazing defense, really injured and struggling offense. First game, man, they won in a shootout versus a very tough Southeastern Louisiana. And going into shootouts, now you're thinking Sam Houston could be potentially back, which could be dangerous for Nicholls, who Sam Houston shut down their longest, best quarterback in probably history in 4K. Sam Houston was able to shut them down. I was at that game last year. Sam Houston looked bigger on both lines. I think it's going to be tough for Nicholls to pull this one out.
So real question, though, is, and this is coming from Stuart Chapman as well, he was concerned about how some people like myself had Sam Houston jumping up there even though they didn't play last week. But he does want to know, similar to Shane, will this game propel them into a real title contender, like national title? It's great to talk about the Southland. It's great to talk about a good matchup between these teams. Can one of these teams win the national championship after this game? Is their perspective going to go up above what we perceive as the big three? I personally think yes, because of the chaos. Like normally, it just seems the last couple of years, obviously you have NDSU, you've had James Madison, Eastern Washington 2018, where you're like, it's one or two, would be lucky to see a 3-team get in there. But based off what's happened so far this spring and weak quarterback play and lack of depth, why couldn't a team from a non-Power 3 conference or anywhere else win it? So I think this absolutely makes you a title contender. Is there pushback? Jamie, what do you think on that, man? You're a James Madison fan. Your team's number one up there. You guys are looking good. You had a rough week last week, but would you worry about a Southland team coming to James Madison?
I don't really worry about anybody coming to Bridgeport Stadium, to be honest. We've lost one time since 2015 ended. So, and of course, that was a team we struggled with this past week. I tried to erase it from my memory, but no, but of course, it was the same coach that we have now, Kurt Signetti. So he's won every game he's played at Bridgeport there. So do I worry about a team coming in? No, but does that mean that Sam Houston couldn't come in there and run over us? Of course they could. Does Nicholls run over us? Of course they could, because they both have excellent quarterback play. And that's going to be something I'm really going to watch this week is the quarterbacks. Just the way the two guys played over the last few weeks. The Nicholls quarterback name is just escaping me. Lindsey, what's his last name?
Yep, it's Lindsey Scott.
Lindsey Scott. Sorry, Nicholls fans. Sorry, Lindsey, for missing that. And then Eric Schmid. I didn't know if he was going to be the guy coming into this year, but he looked really good against SLU. So I'm expecting a shootout. And to answer the actual question, why couldn't the winner of this game or even the loser of this game make a run? It's a wild spring, and if you've got a quarterback, you're in better shape than 95% of the nation.
Yeah, Shane and Stuart, a good way to put it before we move on to the next topic is Right now, if you polled 10 different people, who's the number 1 team, who's the number 2 team, you probably get 10 different answers for number 1 and number 2. So since there's no real consensus to where we all have some passion that there's an overwhelming dominant force out there in the FCS this spring, why not Sam Houston or Nicholls or anybody else who plays really well throughout the spring season? So, yep, this game will put everybody on high alert for possibly a seed, possibly a national title contention. And speaking of national title, undefeated teams looking great, Mr. Jamie Williams, a good contributor to our page and maybe a member on this podcast right now,